Boston in winter. The wind swept down the ancient brick walls of Cambridge, shaking bare branches against the stained glass windows of Harvard's Memorial Church. Snow muffled the sound of passing footsteps. Yet amid that silence, one boy lived in the shadow of the world's most prestigious university, utterly unseen. His name was Eli. He was 12, an orphan. He had no documents, no known relatives. The last person who had ever called him by name, his mother, a Haitian immigrant who mopped floors in dormitories, had died during the pandemic 3 winters ago. Since then, Eli had learned how to disappear. He slept in a crumbling maintenance shed behind the church, wrapped in a wool blanket he'd pulled from a dumpster. He ate from leftover seminar lunches, always cold, always half-eaten, always enough. But it wasn't the cold or the hunger or even the loneliness that defined his nights. It was the bells. 2:17 a.m. A single bell rang out across the empty yard. Eli stirred beneath his blanket. 12 minutes and 7 seconds later, another bell. Then, 8 minutes and 3 seconds after that, another. The bells did not ring like clockwork. They did not follow any simple rhythm or hourly chime. No one else seemed to notice, but Eli had been listening for months. There was something peculiar about them. He began to keep track. At first, he drew tick marks on the shed wall. Later, he scrounged a burnt notebook from a trash bin behind Widener Library. Every night after the bells rang, he would light a stub of candle and write down the intervals between chimes. 5 minutes, 1 second. 6 minutes, 11 seconds. 10 minutes, 7 seconds. He didn't know why, but his mind clung to the numbers. They pulsed with a quiet beauty, like starlight blinking through a storm. In the daylight, Eli disappeared. He slipped unnoticed into the back corners of the library stacks. He read books students forgot on tables, not novels, not stories, numbers, number theory, prime sequences, modular arithmetic. He didn't understand all of it, not yet. But the symbols made sense to him in a way language never had. On a cold Tuesday afternoon, Eli discovered a book on Sophie Germain primes, a special class of prime numbers P where 2P plus 1 is also prime. That night, lying beneath a leaking roof, he stared up into the dark and whispered to himself, "What if the bells are primes?" He tore out a page from the back of the book and began calculating. The time intervals, converted to seconds, matched the positions of prime numbers in ways that gave him chills. 727 seconds, 491 seconds, 607 seconds. He checked them one by one. They were all prime. More than that, he noticed the intervals matched known prime gaps, the differences between successive primes, studied by the top research mathematicians in the world. What kind of clock? Rings in primes. The next night, the bell rang at 2:13 a.m. Eli sat up instantly. He didn't sleep much anymore. He'd trained himself to wake with the bell. That night, the sequence was different. 13 minutes, 3 seconds, 17 minutes, 11 seconds, 19 minutes, 23 seconds. Eli's eyes widened. It was a sequence of twin primes, pairs of prime numbers that differ by 2, 11, 13, 17, 19, 23, 25. Except 25 isn't prime. The pattern shifted. It skipped. What could it mean? The next day, something unusual happened. Eli, too curious to stay away, had followed a young graduate student into the mathematics department. She had dark eyes, a Vietnamese name, Cecilia Tran, and a stack of papers spilling from her arms. She dropped a folder near the elevator. Eli rushed to help. "Thank you," she said, surprised. He nodded silently, handed over the folder, but she noticed something strange. Eli's fingertips were ink-stained, numbers scrawled across his wrist. She squinted. Wait, is that a germane sequence? Eli froze. Where did you see that? She asked, genuinely puzzled. He pulled his arm back. I hear them, he said simply. Cecilia blinked. Hear what? The bells. She laughed lightly, then paused. Eli's eyes weren't joking. The bells tell me things. Not in words, in numbers. That evening, Cecilia returned to her office and opened a report from Harvard's number theory lab. She frowned. Their research team had spent 18 months looking for a pattern in bell frequencies recorded in the Cambridge area, an old side project using historical data and audio sensors. A few had joked that perhaps the bells of Memorial Church were coded, but no results. Then she looked at the times Eli had scratched onto his notebook. Her heart skipped. They matched perfectly, and not just matched, predicted. Eli had marked sequences that the lab's software hadn't even detected yet. How was this possible? 1 week later, Cecilia brought Eli into the lab. An assistant scoffed. This is the kid? Cecilia ignored the comment. She sat Eli at a whiteboard. Here's a pattern we can't crack, she said gently. It's based on a conjecture about Mersenne primes. Do you know what those are? Eli nodded slowly. Numbers in the form 2 sa p, 1, where p is prime. The assistant's pen dropped. Eli looked at the board, then at the time sequence. This one's wrong, he said. The third bell should have been 8:1991 seconds after the first. The lab went silent. 8:1991 was the exact value of 2^13, 1, a known Mersenne prime. That night, back in the shed, Eli curled beneath his blanket. A soft snow had begun to fall. For the first time in years, he felt seen. Not by a social worker, not by a system, but by someone who understood what it meant to see numbers where others saw noise. He pulled the blanket tight, listening. The bell rang once more. He smiled. At Harvard, some corridors are colder than snow, not from the wind, from reputation. In the northwest wing of the mathematics building stood an office sealed like a vault, room 301, belonging to Professor Arthur Lansing. Fields medalist, author of The Structure of Elliptic Dualities, holder of 6 honorary doctorates, revered, feared, and famously intolerant of nonsense. When Cecilia Tron knocked on his door, she did so with a trembling hand. Yes? His voice came through like a chisel on stone. She stepped in, Eli behind her, clutching his burned notebook. I need 10 minutes. Lansing leaned back. 10 is generous. Make it 5. Cecilia placed the notebook on his desk. She opened it to a page of prime gaps and bell intervals. These are the bell intervals of Memorial Church, she said. He frowned. And I should care because they match sequences in the twin prime conjecture, and some are predicting Mersenne primes. Lansing leaned forward. Predicted? Eli spoke, voice soft. One of them is 8:191 seconds. That's 2 to the 13th minus 1. Lansing paused. He stared. You calculated that? Eli nodded. From the sound of a bell. Eli looked down. I count them, the spaces between. For a long time, Lansing said nothing. Then he opened a drawer and pulled out a folded document. It was a letter from a think tank in Zurich proposing a prize for proof of large-scale prime pattern predictability. We've tried supercomputers, he muttered. Cecilia added quietly, This child may have something no machine does. Lansing narrowed his eyes. We'll test him. No help, no hints. If he's lying, he isn't, Cecilia said. The test came the next day. A blackboard full of partial sequences, conjectures, holes. Eli looked up. He solved the first one in under a minute. Not by formula, but by intuition. His brain mapped patterns the way birds feel magnetic fields, invisibly, unerringly. Lansing watched, and for the first time in decades, he was silent. By evening, Eli had reconstructed a formula that approximated the distribution of Cunningham chains, a rare prime structure few in the lab had ever seen outside of research papers. But not everyone was impressed. News of Eli spread fast. A child. No school, no papers. Some called it a publicity stunt. Others warned of contaminated data. How can bell chimes be used in serious research? A professor in applied mathematics, Dr. Rothstein, accused Cecilia of academic theater. You're using an orphan to prop up an abandoned conjecture. Cecilia stared back. We're not using him. We're listening. Meanwhile, Eli grew quiet. He felt the shift. He was a guest, not a student. Not yet. The bells still rang. But now they echoed with doubt. One night, he stopped counting. Instead, he walked. Past Harvard Yard, past dormitories glowing with warm light, toward the Charles River. There he sat and wept. But someone had followed him. Lansing. The old man stood behind him, silent. After a long time, he spoke. Do you know why I never had students? Eli shook his head. Because no one ever made me feel like it mattered, until now. He placed a hand gently on Eli's shoulder. Come back. We'll write the proof together. Eli turned. His eyes, red with tears, blinked. And for the first time, someone had said it out loud. You belong here. It was the first morning Eli sat at a real desk, not a bench in the library, not the back row of an empty seminar room. A real desk, with a pencil, a legal pad, and the quiet weight of air that belonged only to discovery. Professor Lansing had cleared his schedule. He called it a sabbatical in motion. Cecilia called it a miracle. Eli just called it another morning he hadn't frozen to death. The equation began not with symbols, but with silence. Lansing wrote a single prompt on the board. What's missing between the primes? Most mathematicians chase the primes. Count them. Divide them. Compare gaps. Eli stared at the negative space. He drew a sequence, the gaps between Mersenne primes, mapped over Fibonacci indices. Then another, gaps between twin primes, laid out over modular residues. By noon, his pad looked like a child had fought a storm with numbers. And then, it happened. He saw something. Not a pattern, not yet, but a shadow of one. An almost. A nearness. He stood up, walked to the board, wrote a line so faint it looked like hesitation. G of n equals P of n plus 1 minus P of n. Then beneath it, delta G of n approximately equals phi of n modulo k minus mu of n over k. Cecilia blinked. Wait, that function's never been mapped. Lansing stood. It doesn't belong to any known sieve. Where did you get it? Eli shrugged. It's just what feels between the primes, the space between the spaces. Lansing stared. That was the beginning. They worked for days. Cecilia helped reformat the terms. Lansing fed in known conjectures. The trio ate at the chalkboard, slept in chairs. Eli never asked for breaks. What they were building wasn't just a model. It was a language. to speak to numbers in their own silence. The breakthrough came when they compared Eli's function to a dataset from the Clay Mathematics Institute, sequences of presumed random prime intervals at high magnitude. Eli's equation didn't just match them. It predicted the next value, within 3 digits, a forecast model for gaps between primes, something long believed impossible. Cecilia whispered, "It's not supposed to exist." Lansing didn't answer. He was crying. The paper was submitted anonymously. Within 48 hours, the Institute requested an interview. One reviewer called it a heretical masterpiece. Another thought it was AI-generated. A third wrote, "This feels like Ramanujan, too elegant to fake, too clean to guess." And yet no name was attached. At the end of the abstract, only this: discovered via auditory intervals from the bell tower of Memorial Church, Cambridge, authored by one who listened. The math world stirred, quietly, then loudly, but Eli didn't notice. He was back in the shed, folding a piece of paper into a triangle. On it, he had written the function. Not for publication, not for proof, but so that if one day he forgot, he'd have something to come home to. Lansing found him there the next morning. "You could be anywhere," he said. "Zurich, Princeton, Tokyo." Eli looked up at the tower. "I think I'd like to build something instead." Cecilia helped him draft the plans. It was a school, just 6 desks and a wood stove. Tucked in a forgotten corner of Cambridge where no zoning office bothered to knock. They painted the walls with equations, taught kids from the shelters how to feel math, not as a rule book, but a rhythm. They listened, not for answers, but for questions. Every morning, Eli rang a small bronze bell, not for time, but for wonder. And every now and then, deep in the night, 2:17 a.m. would come. A chime from the Memorial Church would echo once more through the frost. In that frozen silence, beyond theory, beyond form, the numbers still whispered. And the boy who once counted them alone beneath a leaking roof, he had learned not just to hear them, but to teach the world to listen. The school was small, but it had a soul. They called it the Bell School, not because of any official affiliation with the church across the street, but because every child who came through its wooden door had, at some point, heard something others did not. Eli taught not from textbooks, but from memory. Not from rules, but from rhythm. He drew spirals of numbers on the floor in chalk. He taught the children to listen for patterns in rainfall, in footfalls, even in the slow hiss of the wood stove. "You don't need to know everything," he said to a boy who could barely subtract. "Just learn to ask beautiful questions." In the evenings, after the students left, Eli and Cecilia would sit by the fire. Sometimes Lansing joined them, though rarely without a journal in hand. They talked about the future, not in the way people usually do, jobs, college, resumes, but in ideas. "What if there's a geometry that isn't shape-based?" Cecilia once asked. "Like topology?" Lansing replied. "No, not even that. What if relationships are real, without reference points?" Eli smiled, like the way grief stays even when no one remembers what was lost. But beyond the warmth of the stove and the quiet joy of the children, pressure was building. The paper they submitted, now known as the silent equation, had stirred more than academic awe. It had disrupted. A senior professor at MIT called it a threat to established funding models. Another warned it might delegitimize years of lattice fieldwork. Some accused Harvard of harboring unverifiable intuitionism. Eli didn't read the papers, but Lansing did. One evening, he came into the firelit classroom, face pale. "They want us to present the proof. Not just the equation, but the framework, all of it." Eli looked up from a half-drawn prime wheel on the floor. Where? The Clay Institute. In 2 weeks. Before the full board. They say if it's real, it could change the foundation of number theory. If it's not, Cecilia finished the thought. They'll bury it. For the first time since the bells, Eli was afraid. Not for himself, but for the quiet. For the beauty that had come not from being right, but from being still enough to hear what no one else had heard. He tried to rehearse. Lansing gave him old lecture notes to study. Cecilia coached him through questions. But the more Eli prepared, the more the proof disappeared. The numbers became hard again. The silence slipped away. One night he stood at the blackboard and stared for an hour. Then he turned around. I can't do it. Lansing nodded slowly. You don't have to. We can go without you. No, Eli said. That's worse. I can't be what they want. You don't have to be, Cecilia whispered. Just be what the proof was when it came to you. Eli sat down by the stove. It came in stillness, in the cold, in bells. How do I find that again under fluorescent lights and microphones? No one answered. The fire crackled. The wood popped. 2 weeks passed. The room was marble and glass. The Clay Institute auditorium held less than 100 people. But each one carried the weight of decades of proof and skepticism. Eli wore a second-hand blazer too big for his frame. Cecilia sat beside him. Lansing stood at the podium. Then it was Eli's turn. He walked up with no notes. He looked out across the sea of physicists, logicians, skeptics, and said only one thing. I didn't find the equation. I heard it, in bells, in the space between them, and it didn't start as a formula. It started as a feeling. There was a long silence. He turned to the board, drew one spiral, then another, layered sequences, lattice gaps, modular echoes. He didn't prove the equation. He showed how it danced. He taught it like he taught the children. He listened to the silence between the questions, and when he was done, he put down the chalk. No one clapped. For a full minute, the room stayed still. Then one man, an older scholar from India, stood and whispered, It's true. He didn't mean the math. He meant the listening. And the rest followed. That night, back at the Bell School, the fire burned brighter than usual. Lansing didn't say much. Cecilia just passed Eli a mug of cocoa. You did it, she said. Eli shook his head. No, we did it. Then he looked at the children's drawings on the walls. We're still doing it. Outside, the wind picked up. Far off across the campus, the memorial church bell rang once. Eli smiled and listened. Snow came early that year. By late October, the Bell School's windows were already frosted with thin webs of ice, and children pressed their fingers to the glass, tracing invisible spirals as Eli taught them about infinite sets using buttons and pine cones. Some infinities, he told them, are bigger than others. And the strange thing is, you can hold both in your hand if you know how to look. A girl named Mira asked if numbers could get lonely. Eli smiled. Sometimes I think they do. But maybe that's why they gather in patterns. Cecilia had started bringing her piano to class. Not a full one, just a tiny electric keyboard she kept under her coat. She played quietly as the children learned, slow scales, minor keys. Eli said the math was easier when the room had sound. Lansing came too, though he rarely spoke. He would sit at the back, watching the kids the way one might watch an eclipse, unmoving, as if any sudden shift might break the moment. One afternoon, as they were learning about converging series, Lansing broke his silence. He stood, walked to the board, and drew a long arc from one corner to the other. This, he said, is not a limit. The students looked at him, confused. It's a beginning, he added. Then he sat down again. No one asked what he meant, but they remembered it. News of Eli's proof kept spreading. An article in the New York Times ran the headline, "The boy who heard the universe ring Princeton sent an invitation." Oxford, too. But Eli refused them all. "I'm not a paper," he said. "I'm a person. And this," he gestured to the room, to the fire, to the chalkboard still smeared with half-erased spirals, "is where the math belongs now." Some understood. Others did not. One night a man arrived at the door. He wore a wool coat and had the look of someone who hadn't slept properly in years. "I read the paper," he said, "and I have a son. He doesn't speak, but when I showed him the equation, he smiled. First time in months." Eli invited them in. The boy sat in the corner, silent, staring at the chalkboard. Eli didn't speak either. He just handed the boy a stick of chalk. The boy walked forward and, with trembling fingers, drew a circle. Then another inside it. Then another. A fractal, hand-drawn, perfectly spaced. His father cried. Eli just whispered, "Welcome." That winter, more children came, some from shelters, some from brownstone homes their parents could no longer afford, some who didn't speak English, some who barely spoke at all. Eli taught them all the same way, through quiet, through symbols, through patience. He told them about Georg Cantor, about Hilbert's Hotel, about how some infinities could fit inside others, and how the world had once called that impossible. He wrote on the board, "Infinity is not a number, it is a direction." And the children nodded, even if they didn't yet know why. One night, Cecilia found Eli asleep at his desk. His hand still gripped a pencil, his head resting on a page filled with scribbled notes. Not formulas this time, but lines of text, like a story. She read a few words. Once there was a boy who heard bells, not because he was chosen, but because he was still. In January, the heating went out. The fire kept them warm, but only barely. Still, no one stayed home. They brought blankets, extra socks. Mira gave up her own coat so a new boy from Honduras could have one. They learned about Pascal's triangle that week. Eli told them how the triangle never ends, how patterns hide in every diagonal, how even the odd and even numbers make stripes if you tilt your head just right. "Everything looks random until you stay long enough," he said. "Then it starts to hum." And at that, the boy with no English clapped. On a Thursday, the bell at Memorial Church rang early, just after midnight. Eli woke, stepped outside. Snow was falling in slow, heavy spirals. The kind of snow that silences the world. He listened. One chime, then a pause, then another, longer, lower. He counted the intervals in his head. 323 seconds, 479, 697, all primes. But more than that, they were safe primes, a rare subclass used in cryptography. Unusual, precise. He walked back inside and wrote them down, then curled up beside the fire. Somewhere the bells were still teaching. The next morning, he brought the sequence to Lansing. "I don't know what it means," Eli said, "but it feels deliberate." Lansing read the numbers, then read them again. "Safe primes," he murmured. "Embedded inside a Fibonacci delay." He looked up. "This isn't coincidence." "What is it then?" Cecilia asked. "An answer," Lansing said. "Or maybe a question we haven't learned to ask yet." Eli looked out the frosted window and nodded. It began with a squeak. Mira was tracing a Mobius strip in chalk when her foot caught on a warped floorboard near the back of the classroom. The board bent just slightly under her weight, not enough to break, but enough for Eli to notice. He walked over, knelt, and ran his fingers along the seam. The wood had splintered, slightly raised, not from age but from something beneath. With care, he pried the board loose. Underneath was a small envelope, browned by time, its corners curled. On the front, written in faded ink, were the words, "To whomever still listens." He did not open it right away. Instead, he placed it gently on the desk and stared at it for a long time, as though the envelope itself were part of a proof he didn't yet understand. That night, with Lansing and Cecilia beside the stove, he finally unfolded it. Inside was a single sheet of stationery, written in an old, spidery hand. The ink had smudged in places, but the message was clear. This school once belonged to a man who dreamed in numbers. His name was Elias Bell. He built this room from scrap wood and old hymnals. He believed children could hear the harmony of the world, if only someone would listen with them. If you've found this letter, I ask only one thing. Teach what you love, and never let the quiet be forgotten. At the bottom was a date, February 19th, 1911. Cecilia wept softly. Lansing read the letter 3 times, then folded it and slipped it into the back of his journal. Eli said nothing, but something in his chest, long coiled, long silent, began to ease. The next morning he told the children the story, about Elias Bell, about the letter, about how someone over 100 years ago had believed exactly what they now lived each day. "You see," he told them, "we're not the first." He tapped the board gently. "We're just one note in a much older song." That winter, they began to teach outside. Even in the snow, wrapped in scarves and mittens, the students gathered under the old oak behind the school. Eli taught them how to draw golden spirals in the frost using only string and nails. He showed them how tree branches followed Fibonacci numbers, how pine cones hid fractals, how even silence had form if you knew how to feel it. "It's all connected," he whispered one day, half to himself. "Like what?" asked a boy. Eli smiled. "Like us." The story of the buried letter reached the papers. This time the headlines were quieter. Not about genius, not about disruption, but about something older, gentler, a small school, a quiet fire, and a boy who once listened so carefully to bells that he heard the whisper of a man long gone. Harvard sent archivists. The Memorial Church bell tower was searched. They found old journals, tuning records, even a music manuscript with mathematical annotations scribbled in the margins. It all pointed to one thing, that Elias Bell had indeed existed, and he had left behind a system, a pattern, not for discovery, but for remembrance. Eli kept the letter on the desk. Sometimes, when the children worked in silence, he would glance at it. He never read it again. He didn't have to. One evening, Cecilia brought a new book into the classroom. It was blank. She placed it on the shelf beneath the letter. "This," she said, "is for whatever comes next." Eli nodded. He didn't ask what she meant. He knew. That week, a boy who had never spoken before came to the board and wrote a number. 2, 5, 7, 11, 17. He looked up, waited. Eli didn't say anything. He just picked up the chalk and wrote the next number, 23. The boy smiled, sat down. No words passed between them, only understanding. That night, Eli stayed behind after the fire had dimmed. He pulled out a fresh page and wrote, "There is no end to the prime numbers, but maybe, just maybe, there is a beginning." Then he folded the page, walked quietly to the floorboard where the old letter had been, and placed his note underneath. He pressed the wood back into place. Not to hide it, but to give it time. It happened on a Tuesday. Snow was still on the ground, though melting. The children were finishing a lesson on prime-generating polynomials when there was a knock at the door. Not loud, not rushed, just 3 quiet raps. Eli opened it. A woman stood there, late 40s, gray coat, hands tucked into worn leather gloves. Behind her was a boy, maybe 10. He had large eyes and a blank expression, as though life had already asked too much of him. The woman cleared her throat. "We came from Ohio. We read about you. The boy's name is Jude. He hasn't been to school in over a year." Eli looked down at the boy. Then he opened the door wider. Jude didn't speak. Not for a week. But he listened. He sat at the back, staring at the spirals, at the chalk dust in sunlight, at the soft flares of firelight against the old blackboard. Eli didn't rush him. He gave him paper, gave him space. And one morning, Jude drew a perfect Sierpinski triangle in the margins of a math sheet. Lansing saw it first. He didn't say a word. He just circled it, then handed it back with a single sentence. "Keep going." The world kept knocking. Sometimes it came as letters, stacks of them, parents asking if their children could come. Scholars asking for mentorship, schools asking for help. Sometimes it came as visitors, quietly, without press. Professors, monks, engineers, musicians, all drawn by something they couldn't quite name. Some wanted to prove the equation again. Others just wanted to sit by the stove and watch a child discover what a parabola feels like. No one left unchanged. Cecilia started a registry, not of students, but of those who came and listened. She called it the Quiet Archive. No grades. No degrees, just names, dates, notes like, saw the symmetry in tree rings, understood the rhythm in silence, asked a question no one had asked before. Eli added one entry himself. It read, Jude. March 3rd, said his first word. It was 12. Then he smiled. He knew it was divisible by 3 and 4, and for him that meant something was safe again. One day Lansing didn't come. It was the first time since the school began. Cecilia called his home. No answer. Eli walked there as snow began to fall. He found the old man in his chair, asleep, a book still open on his lap, a formula unfinished on the margin. Eli sat beside him for a long time. When Cecilia arrived, she took his hand. "He would have wanted it this way," she said. Eli nodded. He stood, walked to Lansing's desk, opened his last journal. On the final page was a single line. Listen, even now, especially now. That spring, they planted a tree behind the school, a white oak. The children tied notes to the branches, proofs, sketches, little questions they didn't have answers to yet. Mira tied a string around the trunk and whispered, "This one's for Professor Lansing." Eli didn't speak that day, but he stood beside the tree for a long time. Then summer came, and with it, the world returned again. This time, not quietly. A foundation from New York offered funding, millions, but only if the school moved, scaled, formalized. You could teach thousands, the letter read. You could be global. Eli folded the letter in half. Then he burned it in the stove, not out of anger, but gratitude. "I didn't build this to be big," he told Cecilia. "I built it to be close." She nodded. "And it is." That night, the bells rang again. Not just once, 7 times, in sequence. each chime spaced by prime-numbered seconds. Eli didn't reach for his notebook. He simply stood by the window and listened. When it ended, he turned to the fire. Jude was there, curled up with a notebook of his own. "Did you hear it?" the boy whispered. "I did," Eli replied. "Do you know what it meant?" Eli shook his head. "Not yet. But maybe you will." His name was Rowan. He arrived in early autumn, when the wind had begun to change direction and the leaves fell in spirals instead of lines. Cecilia noticed him first, standing by the fence before sunrise, watching the Bell School like one might watch a memory. He spoke softly, with an accent no one could quite place. "I read backwards," he said. Eli tilted his head. "You mean like from right to left?" Rowan shook his head. "I mean, I see time the way others see space. I remember what hasn't happened yet, but only in pieces." The other children took to him quickly. He was gentle, never loud. He carried a worn leather notebook filled with sketches, clocks melting inward, spirals collapsing, sequences written in reverse. One page caught Eli's eye, a series of negative primes. Eli asked him about it. "They aren't real," Rowan admitted, "but they feel real to me, like echoes of numbers that should have been." Eli didn't laugh. He copied them down. That week, the children studied time, not just hours or calendars, but temporal logic. The way physics bends time, the way ancient philosophers tried to trap it in words. Eli wrote on the board, "If time were a number line, where would you stand?" Mira said, 0, because I don't want to lose anything behind me. Jude said, "Infinity, because I'm not finished yet." Rowan said nothing. Instead, he walked to the chalkboard and drew a loop, then a line breaking from it, moving backward into the spiral's core. Cecilia stared. "That's a Feynman diagram," she whispered. "But inverted." Rowan shrugged. "I saw it in a dream." Eli stayed up late that night reading about time symmetry, about T invariance in physics, about how, at the quantum level, certain equations didn't care whether time went forward or backward. The bells rang at 2:01 a.m., then again at 1:37 a.m., then at 1:11 a.m., backwards. He sat up, heart pounding. He checked the clock, then the logs. The intervals matched known reversible prime sequences, a theory not yet proven, only whispered about in speculative number theory. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, Eli took Rowan aside. "Are you making the bells ring?" Rowan shook his head. "They ring for everyone, but maybe some of us are just standing in the right place to hear them out of order." That afternoon, Rowan wrote something on the back of his notebook and handed it to Eli. It read, "If we understood primes fully, we'd understand not just how time moves, but why it moves at all." Eli stared at the line. It wasn't childish. It wasn't metaphor. It was theory. And something deep in Eli, a chord he had forgotten, vibrated. Cecilia began testing Rowan's patterns. She compared them with recent data from cryogenic quantum simulations at MIT. The results shouldn't have aligned, but they did. Rowan's reverse sequences mirrored energy fluctuations in supercooled atoms, almost exactly. Lansing, had he still been alive, would have called it blasphemy, but Cecilia called it poetry. One morning, Rowan didn't come to school. Then another. By the third day, Eli walked to the little inn where the boy and his mother had been staying. The room was empty. Only the notebook remained. On the final page, written in soft pencil, "Thank you for letting me stand in the past long enough to understand my future." Beneath it, a single line of digits. Eli recognized them instantly. They were the time intervals of the bells, written backward. He rushed home, flipped the paper, and rewrote the sequence forward. What he saw made him sit down. A new structure. A prime sequence never documented but mathematically sound. Rowan had left them a map. Not to the past, not to the future, but to the fold between them. That night, Eli lit a candle. He placed Rowan's notebook beside the old letter from Elias Bell. He did not speak. He did not write. He simply sat by the fire and listened. And far off, as the night deepened, the bell rang once more. Not forward, not backward, just now. The first sign wasn't a theorem. It was a whisper. A girl named Lily, who had never once spoken above a whisper, stood up in the middle of class, walked to the board, and drew an unbroken arc made only of prime gaps, increasing, curving, bending toward a limit no one could name. She said nothing, but everyone in the room understood. It was time. That week, the silence that had long protected the Bell School began to hum. Not with noise, but with attention. The proof that Eli and Lansing had built, the one drawn from bells, gaps, and grief, had finally made its way to the Clay Institute's permanent archive. Then quietly, it was picked up by a physicist in Geneva, who began modeling gravitational waves using Eli's prime-based gap patterns. The results were impossible, or rather, undeserved, too beautiful to explain, too elegant to disprove. Soon after, a conference in Kyoto named the model the Bell field equation. They claimed it could map space-time curvature in low-energy systems. Some called it the missing piece of quantum gravity. Others called it poetry in disguise. Eli said nothing. He stayed with the children. Then one morning, the world arrived. For real this time. Trucks, reporters, letters, emails, funding offers, articles titled, "The Homeless Boy Who Outran Hilbert," "The Church Bell That Shook String Theory," "Can Numbers Heal Us?" Eli turned off the lights, closed the door, sat at the edge of the fire. He felt it, the noise creeping in. Cecilia placed a hand on his shoulder. "You can't stop it now," she said gently. "The silence did its part." Now comes the echo. He looked up. But echoes distort. That afternoon, a film crew arrived from Switzerland. They asked to see the chalkboards, the spiral wall, the desk, the floor where Elias Bell's letter had once slept. Eli said no, not out of pride, but reverence. He gathered the children. He told them the truth, that the world now wanted to see the work they had done, that their spirals and their silences had echoed farther than any of them had dreamed. One boy raised his hand. "Will we still get to do math?" Eli smiled, eyes stinging. "Yes, but we may have to do it in a new way." So they adapted. They wrote equations in sand trays, built models from twigs and stones. They stopped publishing and started planting. One child wrote Fibonacci sequences on leaves, then let the wind carry them away. Another created modular arithmetic patterns using flower petals and spoons. They weren't hiding. They were returning to the beginning. Meanwhile, the Bell field equation grew. Geneva used it to refine gravitational lensing models. Tokyo applied it to sound frequency analysis in deep-sea sonar. Nairobi mapped drought cycles using its harmonic predictions. But the one who had first heard it, had whispered it from between walls and bells, stayed in a one-room schoolhouse beside a cracked fire. One day, a girl who had lost her parents in a war walked into the school. She said her name only once. Eli gave her chalk. She sat for an hour, then drew a perfect wave, not sine, not cosine, a hybrid curve, unique but familiar. It matched the distortion field recorded at CERN the previous week. Perfectly. No one else had seen it yet, but she had. That night, Eli wrote one sentence in his journal. Maybe the silence was never ours to keep. Maybe it was waiting to be heard by someone else. And then something strange happened. The bells stopped. No more 2:17 chimes, no midnight sequences. Only quiet. Eli waited. 1 night, 2, a week, nothing. He walked to the church, climbed the narrow steps to the bell tower, dust in the air, silence all around. And there, on the inside of the bell, someone had scratched a single line with a knife or a nail. You listened. Now teach them to speak. He descended, returned to the fire. And for the first time he opened the school to the world, not for fame, not for reward, but for a single reason. So no one would ever forget what the silence had taught. That winter, the Bell School became more than a school. It became a pattern, not an institution, but a rhythm. Children came, listened, left, built their own, in train stations, on boats, in refugee camps, in quiet corners of libraries. They taught prime numbers as lullabies, symmetry as forgiveness, silence as truth. Mathematics stopped being silent. It became something new, not louder, just wider, just warmer. Years passed. The Bell School never closed, but it never stayed the same. Its walls changed hands. Its roof was mended, then let fall. Its floorboards echoed with footsteps from children who never stayed long, but always left something behind. And Eli? He grew older, but never away. Cecilia moved to Vermont. She started a small institute for sensory mathematics, a place where people studied equations not through lecture, but through touch, through sound, through story. She and Eli wrote letters, never long, just notes. One said, "They're learning prime gaps through rhythm. You'd love it." Another, "I dreamed of the bells again. They weren't ringing. They were listening." Jude became a teacher. He never stopped carrying his first notebook, the one where he first understood 12 as a safe number. He taught in Alaska, then Nepal, then New Orleans. He said math was the only thing that stayed warm when the world turned cold. He visited Eli once, years later. They didn't talk about equations. They talked about time, about children, about the fire. And when he left, Jude whispered, "You gave me a voice." Eli said nothing, but his eyes smiled. One spring, Eli stopped teaching. He didn't say why. He just began spending more time in the bell tower. Not climbing it, just sitting near it, listening. Not for the bells anymore, but for something quieter, something deeper. He wrote fewer things down. Some students noticed. They asked why there were no more journals, no more chalked equations. He said, "Because the last things worth knowing don't live on boards. They live in you." Then one day, he disappeared. No ceremony, no goodbye. He left only a single note, folded on the desk. The proof was never the numbers. It was that we stayed, and we listened. Now it's yours. Make it sing. Some say he walked north. Others say he died beneath the oak behind the school. But those who truly understood Eli, they knew. He didn't leave. He became part of the silence, the same silence that had once hidden a letter in the floor, that had spoken through bells, that had carried Rowan's backwards time, that had cradled every lonely child who saw numbers as shelter. Years later, a child at a refugee camp in the Balkans wrote an equation no one understood. It matched the Bell field equation, but it had something new, a variable not known, a symbol no one had taught. When asked where he learned it, the boy said, "I didn't. I just heard it, one night in the wind." Another child in Bolivia, deaf since birth, tapped out a rhythm in clay pots that, when recorded, matched the prime intervals used in cryptography models Eli had predicted decades ago. When asked how she knew, she smiled. "I don't know, but it feels like remembering." And so the proof continued. Not written, not spoken, but shared. Through hands. Through firelight, through children who dreamed in numbers, through questions that never demanded answers. Through the echo of a bell that no longer rang, because it no longer had to. Each year, on February 19th, a group of students gathers in a quiet room. They don't bring notebooks. They don't speak. They sit by the stove. At exactly 2:17 a.m., they strike a small bell. Once. Then they listen. And they remember a boy, once nameless, once invisible, who heard something no one else could, and decided to teach the world not how to solve math, but how to love it. Thank you. Thank you for listening, not just with your ears, but with your heart. This story was never about genius. It was about silence, about the children the world forgot, about the sound of bells ringing in the winter night. Not to summon, but to wait, for someone who would hear. You had every reason to walk away, but you stayed, with Eli, with Cecilia, with a boy who once listened so quietly that the universe answered in numbers. This story is for you, for anyone who has ever felt like they didn't belong, but still kept counting, for the teachers who teach without chalk, for the listeners who love before they understand. We hope you found something here. Not an answer, maybe not even a question, but a kind of stillness, a warmth, a pattern you didn't know you already knew. If there is one message we leave you with, let it be this. You don't need to be brilliant to hear the truth. You just have to stay long enough in the quiet. Because sometimes the quiet is holding up the whole world. Thank you for reaching the end. Thank you for listening with us. And if, one night, you happen to hear a church bell ringing out of rhythm, pause. Maybe Eli is still counting.